On there? Excellent, right. Thank you very much. I appreciate that it's a nice sunny day out there and it would be good to be out in the sunshine, so I'm going to make this as interesting and interactive as I can. My background, I'll put the sort of background slide up here. I spent 25 years in the Royal Air Force as a flight instructor, a supervisor, systems engineer, requirements manager, and during that time I got exposed to human factors as a supervisor, as an instructor, and recognized that as I was going through my diving career, which started in sort of 1999 as certified, then didn't do anything for 5 years, that there was a lot of parallels that we could take from aviation and apply it to the diving community. And at that time, so in 2011, I wrote a white paper that said, look, these are the areas that we can improve in diving. And it didn't go down too well with the training agencies because it picked holes in a lot of the systemic areas. I did a master's in systems engineering, aerospace systems, and again, bringing that systems thinking to trying to solve the problems, and then moving into more modern systems thinking and safety too, of why do things happen the way they do, trying to again bring that into the diving side. My diving is predominantly, in fact all of it, sports diving, technical diving. I don't do any commercial or paid for work. I'm not a dive instructor. I do a lot of this work in the human factors and work with diving instructors to try and bring this content into there. I work for Global Underwater Explorers as their Director for Risk Management and look after quality control and quality assurance of all the instructors and the students that go through our training programs. But I'm certified to 75 meters on Trimix mixes open circuit and 45 meters on Rebreather technology, JJ Rebreather. The work that I do is not just in the diving domain. When I left the Air Force in 2015, I went straight into the offshore industry, working out in the Middle East with crews there delivering similar programs to what I do to the diving community. Couple of days of coaching and training, and then actually face-to-face work on the oil rigs themselves. And from a cultural point of view, was a big eye-opener for me. Not really, I knew about how difficult the culture could be, but actually where you've got the majority of the supervisors are Western European, or as they describe themselves as rednecks, and most of the workers were Middle East, Southeast Asian, or Indian subcontinent. And the ability for people to challenge in that environment was incredibly difficult for them. And saying to those guys, look, you need to bring your position down so that you can learn and we can discuss these things. And most importantly, when people make mistakes, it is okay to talk about those. Same applies in healthcare, working with intensive care unit teams and then moving into the diving area, because when the money fell out of the oil market, there's no money left for training. So I really had a passion for diving anyway. And so, well, actually, how do I bring this? How do I commoditize, how do I make it a tool that people can use, which is where the training started in February 16. So since then, I've delivered training to about 280 people face-to-face through training programs and numerous conferences all around the world. And in fact, I've just finished 4 days at IMAS and UTAS working with teams there. And I was in Auckland last week running 2 programs. And I'm just about to go off to Bali and run some classes up there with the technical dive team before going across to Singapore for the Asian Diver Expo. I've got a big interest in this concept called safety 2, which is why does stuff happen? Safety 1, the traditional way of safety is stuff goes wrong, let's identify the wrong thing, fix it and move on. And now safety 2 is stuff happens all the time, so let's reinforce the good stuff. Yeah, we're not going to ignore fixing the bad stuff, but actually let's reinforce what good looks like and develop that so that everybody can, share in that excellence. And just culture, which is the 3rd session that we're going to cover today, is why is that so important for the diving community and actually all communities really, to be able to talk about the mistakes we make in a fair manner that says everybody's trying to do the best they can, irrespective of the pressures that are there. And there are very few people who are genuinely negligent. When people work for organisations, in the main, any rules that they break or compromise are for organisational gains and not for individual gains. So to punish people for benefiting an organisation without fixing the systemic problems doesn't actually help the organisations. And finally, on this bit is 12th of March, I wrote and published a book. Well, it took me longer than just one day. It's about 6 months worth of work to go and put this book together, which contains numerous case studies across recreational, technical cave diving, and some bits in sort of research community as well, of showing the case studies and then showing the theory behind that and joining these concepts together. Recognise that even if people appear to do really stupid things, it makes sense for them to have done what they've done. And it's building on that theory so that people can then apply it to their own diving. So today, it's going to be 3 sessions of about 45-50 minutes that look at human error and human factors. What does that mean? And what is, potentially the utility of looking at human error? Then we're going to talk about mental models and how situational awareness and decision making go together. Most people have an idea of how decisions are made. In reality, most of the decisions we make are subconscious and they're done on an automatic basis based on emotions, biases and heuristics. And then the final session will be on just culture, what it is, how do we develop it, and really importantly about trying to get the message out there to change attitudes to people making mistakes, getting away from blame, because blame is the enemy of safety, because it means that people do not tell the full story and we never actually understand the context which is going on. If you blame an individual for making a mistake and you've got systemic issues, you blame that person, you fire them, you move on, the issues are still latent there and we need to address those. So, what I'd like you to do, if you've got a pen, I'd like you to take it out. If you haven't got a pen, there's a bit of physical manipulation required of your fingers. So what I'd like you to do, get the pen or your finger, and I'd like you to draw, point at the ceiling, and draw a clockwise circle. And if that's your finger, do this. Look at the ceiling, draw a clockwise circle. Now gradually bring your hand or the pen down, and then look at the top of your finger. Which way is the finger going? Or the pen going? It's going the other way around. And what I'd like to do over these 3 hours is try to change your perspective on how things happen in terms of human error, human factors and human performance. Because when we still look at things from a different perspective, we get a different view. Often we talk about the good side of diving. Top left, cave diving or cenote diving up in Mexico, great fun. On a scooter in 4 nights last year, great fun. Diving in basking sharks up on the west coast of Scotland, snorkeling with my kids, and then bottom right in Egypt on a wreck called the Salem Express, which ironically was lost due to collisions primarily down to human factors. The skipper decided that he was going to take a shortcut across the reef at night, big storms, and he missed, with the waves that were there, he missed the waves breaking on the reef. And it was a roll-on, roll-off ferry, and as he cracked the bow against the reef, the door cracked open and flooded the thing, and it sunk within 30 minutes. There were about anywhere between, depending on who you speak to, anywhere between 600 and 900 people on that ferry when it went down, as it was coming back from Saudi. And when you go and look on there, the bits that you can see on the, in fact, let's see if this works. Down here, this is sun shelter from the top. The lifeboats themselves never got launched. There's a number of inflatable lifeboats lying around the wreck. And that skipper, what he thought was a sound decision at the time, ended up costing hundreds of people's lives. And then every year we have scuba Santas at an inland dive site near us, which is a bit of a laugh. And then we get the bad side. Added gas, problems on the surface, trying to recover, equipment failing. And then the image of the helicopter coming down. There's a colleague of mine, the guy in the red dry suit was just about to be lifted off. It was my buddy as we ascended from a 50-odd metre dive. And at 6 metres, in fact we got shot on back, it was out there. The shot was on 14 and we got to 6 meters, and we extended our 6 meter stop on 100% oxygen. And it's like, yeah, I think we're going. Well, no, actually, let's extend a bit more. And we got to the surface, and I got him to go on the boat first, and he's on the lift. So a lot of the hard boats we have in the UK have got lifts. He's on the lift, he sits down, and I get on the lift, and I'm being lifted up, and I'm just about to step off the lift to sit down, and I see Alex convulsing and then just collapses on the seat. Fortunately, we had a paramedic on the boat who basically gave him some oxygen, rested him, got him in the right place, and we called a mayday, and the helicopter came out. We have no idea what happened to him. It wasn't oxygen toxicity, it wasn't a bend, not quite sure what it was. But it's this stuff that happens. We have no... Just like that. Oh no, everybody's going to look at you now for breaking the seat. There we go. Stuff breaks in real world too when we go diving. So we've got to have those contingencies. And then we end up with the ugly side of it, where people die. And this is the side in diving that often doesn't get talked about. For a start, it's not very good business sense for a customer to walk into the shop and you say, you do realise you might die doing this sport. Okay, I'll just leave. We're not very good about talking about the fatalities because they become very emotive. We don't want to give the dead person a bad name, and yet they're human. They all make mistakes too. And from my perspective, fatalities are a rubbish way of learning about what happened, because invariably the decision maker is dead. You can't ask them how and why it made sense for you to do what you did. And that's where a lot of what I'm trying to do and promote a just culture is to get people to talk about those mistakes, to be able to put their hands up and say, I screwed up, and this is the reason why. Understand those drivers, the systemic bits, the why we make the decisions we do. Unfortunately, a lot of the time we end up bucketing them under this title of human error. And it's a particularly poor term when it comes to learning. Because you made a mistake. Well, how do you get better? Well, don't make those mistakes again, all right? But it's not as simple as that. Because if you end up seeing human error in a report, that means they stopped looking soon enough. They didn't dig deeper, find out why were they distracted? Why did they make those poor decisions? Why was the communication not clear enough? Why did they make some false assumptions? Human error happens all the time. Those who don't like flying, I'm sorry about those stats, 3 to 6 errors per hour are made on the flight deck of an average civil airliner. The good thing is that most of the pilots, they predict when they're going to happen, so they trap them before they even get there. Then when they do happen, they trap them, they mitigate them, and then we don't end up with accidents. And the reason why aviation is as safe as it is because they talk about the accidents or the errors and the mistakes that people make. The reporting systems that are there are designed to share information. Because fundamentally, it's trying to understand why it made sense for that person. And as an example, this goes all the way back to just after the Second World War, where 2 researchers, Jones and Fitz, said, well, why is it that pilots are making the mistakes they do? And the example, one of the pieces they were looking at, was why is it with a bomber crews taxiing in and raising the landing gear while they were still on the runway? And as a consequence, they would collapse the gear, the aircraft would crash on the runway, and then it would block the runway for the other aircraft coming in. And the immediate response was more training, more training, more training. It's like, well, hang on a minute, we're training these guys all the time, what's happening? And the psychologist came on board and went, you do realise those buttons are right next to each other and they're almost identical in touch. So these pilots had come back from a bombing raid, probably quite terrified, they'd made it home. It's dark, they're stressed, and they'd, as part of the alpha landing checks, raise the flaps. They'd reach down, they'd grab a lever and they'd flick it. And it was the landing gear and not the flap switch. So they said, well, how's about we just move these switches spatially, so there are different places on the cockpit, and then we put a wheel on the one that's the landing gear. So when the pilot reaches down, he knows tactily that it's the wrong, it's the right or the wrong thing from that perspective. So you're using multiple media to actually get that information across. In diving, we haven't got that maturity at all. if we look here, is causes. In other words, the root cause is most commonly diver error. Well, that's really useful, not when it comes to learning. If you look at this one, in most cases the inquiry ends with establishing the proximal cause of death. As we'll show as we go through this, accidents are not a final single thing. There are a number of factors that come together. Safety is an emergent property of a system. It's created by people with equipment in an environment based on the tasks. At the same way that unsafety is an emergent property of a system. It takes lots of things to come together, and what we need to do is raise that awareness to say what are those factors and how do they come together. Other piece of research from the Divers Alert Network, the fatalities workshop they ran in 2011. And this was data that was based on stuff from the late 90s and early 2000s. So the paper was written in 2008. And they looked at what were the triggers, the disabling injury, and then the cause of death, or how we go here, disabling agent, disabling injury, and cause of death. Highlighting out of air as that trigger. That was the trigger in 41% of fatalities. That's great bit of research, but not particularly useful for divers, because we all tell our divers not to run out of gas. So I'm just going to tell you again, when you go diving next time, don't run out of gas.
Yeah, Gareth, David Smart, I'm Director of Hyperactive here. We've just taken this a couple of steps further in relation to having predisposing factors, and we do a set of root cause analysis, chain of events analysis.
Brilliant.
Just published a paper in the most recent Diving and Hyperactive Medicine, a review of the 20 years of diving deaths in Tasmania.
Cool.
And it takes it a hell of a lot further
Brilliant.
up the tree because we were not satisfied with this end point of being a single event that had no means of preventing it in the future. So the predisposing factors have actually led to a lot more insights into what happens leading to deaths in divers.
Brilliant. Thank you. I will go and get the latest copy of DHM then. And just as a question then, how many of those factors were outside of the individual? Did they go into organisational and?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
So one of the bits, this is a slide or two images from a presentation given by Paul Schutt from NASA, looking at the fact that humans are also, whilst they're the introduce errors, they also trap a significant number of them. So as we look at, this is from obviously an aviation framework, we're looking at the system designer. Well, that arrow is the errors that are propagating across the system. And then the manufacturer, well, he catches some of them. And actually, if we go to the next piece, often we focus on the pilot on the right-hand side, or we used to, as the straw that breaks the camel's back. But actually, they've trapped loads of stuff as we go through the system. And it's that need to address the system view rather than the individual stupid diver or stupid pilot. And that's really what human factors as a concept is about, is focusing on the individual's activity, how they interact with the controls, the displays, the user interface, their individual behaviours, looking at their thought processes, motor skills. Then we go a bit further than that and we say, okay, so how does that individual deal with the group or the team? How do they communicate? How do they cooperate? Then we go a bit further, the organisation and the management, the leadership that goes on, the hierarchy of authority gradient that's there. How easy is it to speak up and challenge if need be? And then we go a bit further out, and then we look at the legal and the regulatory framework, and then we talk about the societal and the cultural pressures. That is where most people focus on in terms of human factors and ergonomics, and in fact it's a whole thing, it's part of a system. And what I spend a lot of my time is at the team individual area to try and plug gaps further up the system. You could simplify it as basically making it easy for Homer to do the right thing. And from this point of view, he's got a control system which is quite similar to the old nuclear powered station displays. Loads of buttons, loads of dials, loads of controls, and no real idea of what they're supposed to do. And then Homer's sitting there with Mr. Burns on his shoulder going, keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. But Homer likes a donut. And he likes lots of donuts. And as a consequence, his blood sugar level drops when he's not eating his donuts. And he eats one every hour, on the hour. And then at 5 to the hour, when his levels are a bit low, all hell breaks loose. And he's trying to work out what the hell is going on with his control system, because the dials and controls don't actually make sense. And he's got Mr. Burns going, keep it going, keep it going. I need a donut, keep it going. What's going on? All of this stuff. Human factors is about trying to improve this job for people. It's not about necessarily changing the human. And you look at this, so the words door release on the top one, horrible noise on the bottom. And understand, why would somebody do this? And as an operator, you'd sit there and go, what? That's a stupid thing to do. But as a maintenance guy who's got a limited budget, all I need to do is run the cable up through the center one at the top. Off we go. And I'm guessing that the one on the bottom was added afterwards, because now we've got to put these emergency procedures in place. In the context of aviation, this was one of the seminal events for aviation when they shut down the wrong engine, Kegworth crash, 74 people killed, 47 injured, when their pilots ended up gliding their 737 badly to land short of East Midlands Airport. And this happened Trans-Asia in February 16, again when the pilot shut down the wrong engine, and I'll come on to this incident in a bit more detail later on. In diving, ambient pressure inspiration rebreathers. This is the separator that goes between the scrubber to take the CO2 out of the breathing loop and the main unit itself. A number of incidents where that O-ring and that spacer piece have been left out, and the divers have got hypercapnia or CO2 hit. Well, actually, we can design a lot of this stuff out. And this is the Mark 6, Poseidon Mark 6 rebreather, whereas a fatality where the diver hadn't put the scrubber material in, it was only a 12-meter dive, and they dived on their own. They'd gone down to retrieve an anchor, and they'd forgotten to put the scrubber canister in, and ended up having a seizure or drowned at the bottom. Now Hollis designed a system so that you can't actually close the lid on the rebreather unless the canister is in, because the plunger is at the bottom of the canister section that allows you to close the lid. Now that doesn't mean that you don't put the scrubber material in the canister, because that's another area that people can fail. But trying to design out errors is a key point. Now looking at individual problems or systems problems, this is a military rebreather from Norway, and the manufacturer was told, can you modify the valve handle under the diver's glove? And this was the first test dive that they did. Diver got in, everything was working fine, he got out, and the oxygen was turned off. And the dive supervisor said, well, you turned the oxygen off. And they went, no, I didn't. I said, okay, it was on when you got in, you were in the water on your own, and it was off when you got out. You must have turned it off. This is what happened. So when the designers were building that knob, they were unaware that the divers would be using thick wet gloves, and there was something else close by that could end up shutting the system down. So it's interactions and relationships within this system that we've got to look at to improve safety and performance. But human error or human failures come under different categories. We could talk about errors, which is where we normally look at, the slips, the lapses and mistakes, and then the violations, which is normally an intended action to break a rule. It is a conscious decision. There are very few situations where people are genuinely reckless, because if they knew that they were going to end up seriously injured or dead, they wouldn't do it. So it's understanding what's likely to happen afterwards. All of these give you opportunities to learn. And again, this is why a just culture becomes so important, is why did people break the rules, or why did they make the mistakes, so we can try and fix those bits. From a point of view of human error, if we look at it and you say, well, actually, I'm going to choose an outcome. The expected outcome's there, that's great, we carry on. but actually we end up with something that's unexpected. That's what we normally classify as an error, is an unexpected outcome. Then we choose the right thing to do the next time. Well, what's the difference? We're trying with the best information we can. You can only really classify error until after the event. Because if people knew they were going to do errors or make errors, they wouldn't do it. So it doesn't, again, necessarily help us in that context. If we're in a novel environment, that's where we end up with this knowledge-based decision making. We're trying to make the best fit given the information we've got. It's called satisficing. It's good enough. And we do that by matching previous experiences and knowledge to the situation. And if we've never encountered it before, don't be surprised that we make mistakes, which is why the error rate is quite so high. It's anywhere between 1 in 2 and 1 in 10. So a 50-50 chance in a life-critical situation is not a particularly great place to be. But you may never have encountered that situation, so you try the best you can. But don't be surprised when those errors happen. When we're in rules-based decision making, that's not just technical rules, procedures, regulations. It's also social rules, social conformance, that people are behaving a certain way, so I'm going to comply with that because we don't want to put our hand up and be different. And I'll show a couple of videos of that later on. And then skill-based is a lot of that is motor skills, stuff that we don't even think about. And the reason we make errors here is because of distractions. We go through a sequence that we've done loads and loads of times before, and then something takes our attention and we forget where we are, and because we're constantly looking into the future, we join our sequence a little bit further on than we thought. So if we look at the environment that people are in and the errors that are made, let's try and fix those bits. But I said aviation has taken this concept that says everybody's fallible, we share that knowledge, and we have that just culture in place. And this clip from Sully demonstrates, or there's a couple of bits I'm going to demonstrate based on this video clip. We just had a massive bird strike, and he said, called a mayday, and they're going to ditch on the Hudson.
Pull up. Pull up. Pull up.
Brace.
Pull up.
And this is the difficulty in the diving community, is sharing that knowledge. We're not particularly good at that because we don't want to talk about the mistakes we've made. And there's no real definition of incident. We have fatalities and everything else when it comes to reportables. A number of bits that came out of this situation. One, the experience allowed him, the captain, to shortcut the checklist. There is a checklist for a double engine failure on a 2-engine aircraft, which you think is a bit odd, but it's designed for operating at 30-odd thousand feet for fuel starvation, ice in the fuel, or volcanic dust, those sorts of things where the engine's shut down and you've got time to come down and descend. At this stage, they were less than 3,000 feet. Item 8 or 9 on the checklist is turn the auxiliary power unit on, which gives you flying controls and electrical power for the instruments. If they'd followed the sequence properly, they would have crashed. But because they knew why the checklist and the sequence was put in place, that allowed them to shortcut it. Another piece that was looking at the outcomes, when they went to the investigation, the National Transport Safety Board, they wanted to find out why they didn't divert into LaGuardia Airport or Teterboro Airport, which were the two diversions nearby. Why did they ditch in the river? So in the investigation, the hearing, they went across to the Airbus simulators in Toulouse and asked the test pilots to run through the scenarios. And the board hadn't seen these outcomes at this stage. So they ran the first simulation, the pilots got airborne, they hit the flock of geese, they executed the checks, and they landed back at LaGuardia. And the captain and the co-pilot were like, maybe we made the wrong decision, because they sort of weren't sure they'd done the right thing. So they ran the simulation again for Teterboro, hit the birds, configured the aircraft, and landed back. And Sully asked the president of the board, how many times had they done that before? 16. So that was their 17th attempt at running that simulation. And so we didn't have that opportunity. It's like getting to the end of a video game level where you've got the boss to fight and you've got to work out, get past all those chinks in the armour. And they said, well, actually, we didn't know what was going on as well. It took us time to work out what was going on. And the president of the board said, okay, let's add 35 seconds, because that's how long it took you from strike to start configuring the aircraft. So they added 35 seconds for the test pilots to fly their mission, and both times they flew into the tower blocks on the way into LaGuardia and Teterboro. And the president said, we don't need to run any more simulations now. And it was their experience operating as a crew, both the cockpit crew and the back-end crew, and air traffic control. And air traffic control operating with the helicopters in the area, the other aircraft in the area, all operating this concept of crew resource management, sharing a mental model about what's going on. So that's the proactive side. In terms of the reactive side, looking at accidents happening, this is the dash cam from a camera in Taiwan in February 2016, where the pilot shut down the wrong engine. And the reason they shut down the wrong engine was because they'd been conditioned through their training that it was always the second engine, the right-hand engine, that failed when you had an engine failure after takeoff. But all the sims they ran was exactly the same scenario. Coupled with the fact that he was a weak captain, he wasn't very confident, required extra training, and his co-pilot with the authority gradient was there, was unable to challenge the captain. And the captain grabbed the throttle, and instead of pausing and waiting for the co-pilot to say confirmed before following through, he grabbed it, shut it down. And it was the wrong engine, and it was the other side that had failed. And they were only at 1,500 feet, and there were 58 on board and 43 killed. We have a little prediction engine running in our heads all the time, and we're trying to look to the future and say, what's going to happen next? But we can't get that right all the time, so we make these gambles and saying, that's good enough, that's what I think is going to happen based on those previous experiences. And it's recognizing that fallibility that says, how do we improve that? Through sharing of knowledge of what does good look like and what does bad look like. Because in the real world, a lot of time, we just focus on the odd things that happen, that bit that sticks out, the unwanted event. And yet most of the time, stuff is happening normally. So let's reinforce that. And that was the session I ran up at UTAS this morning, this appreciative inquiry system that's saying, let's reinforce the good things and make that, and one of those is actually standardization and helping from that point of view. Because standardization helps prevent drift. But there are lots of things going on that prevent us from being, inverted commas, safe. You can't really define safe. We can define safer or less safe. But to define safe is very difficult. So on the top right, we've got money pressures, financial pressures that are pushing us towards unsafety on the left-hand side. We've got workload that's pushing that way as well. Because increase the workload, we create unsafety. It's not as safe as it could be. And then we end up with the organization pushing safety measures that way. We don't know, we build in a safety margin, this dotted line, this marginal boundary, which has a gap between that and the failure line. The problem is we don't know where failure is. We build this arbitrary error margin in, and we're trying to keep that as close to the center point as possible. The difficulty is because we don't know where that marginal boundary is, we stitch it. We create procedures, that acceptable operating point, that's what the guidelines, the rules, the regulations, the acceptable behaviors are. And unfortunately, because the real world never matches the stuff that's written down, we start drifting. And that point 2 is what I call as those safe, scary moments. You get back from a dive, you go, that was close. I'm not going to do that again. But unless you identify what the precursors were and the bits leading into that, then we are going to have that happen. So we stitch this line. The problem is that the more you stitch it and you go out on the other side, on the left-hand side, we drift further and further. And as long as nothing happens, we now establish a new baseline. And this is exactly what happened in the Challenger, and where this concept of the normalization of deviation comes from. Whereas an organization, they drifted because they still thought they were safe. but they were a long way from that. And I'll cover more of that in the decision-making piece. And then we set that baseline, and then that's just considered acceptable. We still don't know where the gap between the dotted line is and the failure line. What we can do is we can have feedback. We can develop awareness, self-awareness of ourselves, of our teams, by having a set of baselines, by having feedback. And the point here is that for high reliability organizations, they sit close to that failure line because they're accurate in their feedback, they're honest in their feedback, and they try to get that information across. Those who are low reliability organizations, they don't have a feedback mechanism, so they're dotted all over the place. At an individual level, this concept called the Dunningkruger effect. We don't know what we don't know, and even worse, we don't know that we don't know. And this concept comes from, say, late 90s, where two researchers were trying to find out why are incompetent people, why don't they know that they're incompetent? And he basically ran some experiments of 4 setups of grammar, logical reasoning, humour, and there was another one which I can't remember what it was. It was maths. And they asked people, how well do you think you scored in that exam? And that's what the lines on the top were. The grey line, the diagonal line, is their actual scores. So those people who were incompetent, i.e. they genuinely scored low scores, anywhere between, sort of looking at these, between sort of 15%, so that was what they really scored. What they thought they scored was in the order of 60 to 70%. So they had no idea that they were that bad. And that's the worst bit, is that they thought they were good, but they were rubbish. At the other end of the scale is where the experts looked at this and went, well, I don't think I'm very good. And they underscored themselves, even though they were much more competent. And what Dunningkruger found out was, the other thing is that experts find it difficult to understand why incompetent people are incompetent and they don't understand their incompetence. Because they look at this and go, that was obvious that that was the wrong answer. And they can't understand that bridge because they've developed their knowledge over time so they can make that gap, they can understand the problems. They can't put themselves in that incompetent person's shoes. Now when we talk about a lot of the stuff we do, what is good enough? Is there a definition of good enough? So this is it was done actually from a project management point of view, saying if you've got 10 minutes to deliver or a value, to deliver a project, and it's to spec, what can you deliver in that concept? And we're going to draw a picture of Spider-Man, or he is, and he's got 10 minutes to do it. He spends quite a bit of time planning it. Very clear, getting everything in there, the shading, the detail. It's pretty good. Okay, so now he's only got a minute to do the same thing. You could probably say it's Spider-Man. Not quite sure what this one is though. And he still didn't manage it in time. Now you can go from left to right and go, yeah, I could probably work out that that might be Spider-Man. But if you didn't have the reference points for 10 and 1, I'm not quite sure what you'd make out the right-hand image would be. And that's the problem we've got in terms of diving and the knowledge acquisition is, what is good enough? If we judge good enough by not having an accident, i.e. a serious injury or a fatality, then you might be able to sit on the right-hand side. But you just don't know how close you are to that failure point. Because, as this quote that I gave to a conference recently, we don't get those major smack you in the face issues. It's an aggregation of little things, an accumulation of little things that come together, and then all of a sudden you end up with, I wish I wasn't here. This is not the place I want to be, if you can be conscious at that stage. So what we're trying to do is get high performance. There are a number of biases which are preventing us from learning. First one, fundamental attribution, error or bias, that we judge the person and not the context. We say that they're incompetent, they don't have the skills. But when that happens to us, we blame it on the environment. We don't look at our own skill sets. And when successes happen, we blame, when successes happen to other people, we say that must have been the environment, And when we succeed, it was because of our skills. And so we are looking at things the wrong way. Outcome bias. The worse the outcome, the harsher we judge the situation. Even though you could end up with the same, almost the same process, but not the same outcome. So if a diver is diving side mount and they come back and one of them is full of gas and the other one has got almost nothing left in it, they went, yeah, great, look at this. That worked really well. I was okay. But they don't look at the fact that they should have swapped the regulators and their process failed. If you surface with not a lot of gas and you think that's okay because that's all right, it was only a shallow dive, your monitoring process failed. And what's to say that that's not going to fail when you're in a more serious situation? And the other piece is hindsight bias. As observers, we can look at something and say, that was obvious that was going to happen. And the image here is from the Clapham Junction train crash, where a driver went through a stop signal at danger and ploughed into the back of another train parked at a junction in London. And it was really easy to sit there and go, they should have done this, should have done that, should have done that. Anytime you hear should, could, or would, that's hindsight. Because people don't intentionally have major accidents. Not unless you're suicidal, and those are few and far between, fortunately. So I look at this clip here and just say, were they distracted, or was this expected to happen? And when I put this on social media, it's normally, especially LinkedIn actually, from the safety professionals, idiot, deserved it. And the others go, no, this is how human attention works. 12 broken ribs and a sternum broken in 2 places is not a great place to be, especially in that environment. And it's like, well, he should have seen the post coming up. Yeah, but somebody's given him something really interesting to look at, a can of beer. There we go. He was a competent wakeboarder, because otherwise he would have piled in before he got anywhere close to the beer can. The difficulty was, why was the post there in the overshoot area? Now, that's another problem with looking at things in isolation rather than context. That might be the only place the boat could moor up. I doubt that that was the first time that he'd done that activity. I guess it was probably the first time that somebody threw the beer can at him and tried to catch it at the same time. So just because you've got highly proficient technical skills, it doesn't mean that actually you're safe for what you're trying to do. Because outcomes, there's a paper that I co-wrote for the Journal of Thoracic Disease with surgeons looking at outcomes. And they're a function, we used to think they're a function of technical skills, and they do contribute to that. But we think if you're really good at stuff, then you're going to be safe and you're going to have a good outcome. And so, well, actually, there's a bit of randomness and there's a bit of luck. And the difference between that two is randomness is at the system level. We don't know susceptibility or genuine susceptibility to decompression sickness. It could happen to you. If it happens to you, that's the luck side of it. So individual versus system. Then we talk about the context and the culture and the environment, how well the equipment's designed. Is it setting you up for a failure or setting you up for success? And then the non-technical skills, which is what I focus on a lot of stuff. Decision making, situational awareness, teamwork, leadership, followership, and understanding the impact of stress and fatigue on that. And you'll notice that those are multiplicatory factors, not just straight additions. Because actually you could end up with some brilliant technical skills, luck doesn't come into it, you're in a brilliant context, but if you've got no awareness and you make a flawed decision, it is going to go horribly wrong from that perspective. So we need to look at all of those and build up competencies in both technical and non-technical skills. And that's the programs that I develop and deliver into the diving community, is looking at the non-technical stuff. The agencies do a lot of the technical work, but they don't really focus on how and why we make the decisions we do, how to communicate effectively as a team, and how to lead, and recognizing genuinely the impact of stress and fatigue on performance. And this is where I put stuff together from these points of view. I've written a book, put the classes together, do training, and come and give presentations like this at conferences, which I really enjoy, because it's about sharing the knowledge. And we're going to take a break shortly, and we're going to have 2 breaks. Feel free to come and poke my chest and ask some questions from that perspective of how to improve your performance, how to improve your safety, from that perspective. So a parting thought for the first piece is, and I don't normally like reading these bits out, but I know that people often take photos. So nobody gets up in the morning and decides today is a great day to die, to get bent, to damage their equipment. Whatever they did, it must have made sense for them to do what they did. And we need to look at those drivers, their experience, their local rationality, if we're going to change outcomes. If we just focus on the outcomes, such as they drowned because they didn't ditch their weight belt, why? Why didn't they ditch their weight belt? It might be that their training environment they're in doesn't allow them to ditch their weights in the swimming pool. So they never actually follow through on the actions. And we talk about practice makes perfect. There's a scenario given to me recently in a paper about a Norwegian policeman who's, you can say party trick, he was very skilled at disarming gunmen with their with handguns. And he would go up and he would do it at ranges and training days and things like this, quickly disarm the person with the gun. It's like, great. Now, one day he was in a shop with a buddy, policeman on duty, and the gunman pulled a gun. In fact, he was off duty at that stage because this is where they ended up resolving it. Gunman pulled a gun and he disarmed the gunman and then immediately gave the gun back to the criminal. And his buddy went, thank you very much, because the criminal was like, you what? His whole thing in his training was da-da-da-da, and then hand the gun back to the policeman or the colleague in the genuine bit. So his sequence went through all of these bits and didn't know where to draw the line as to what was right or wrong. So perfect practice, but didn't fit the context of what was being done. And I would say that's the same with a lot of things we do in diving. We're not very good at monitoring, we're good at actioning stuff, but do we action completely as we're supposed to? And that ends the first bit. So I'm happy to take any questions now, or we're having some coffee or juice outside. And if we start back again at 5 past.